Thank you everyone for joining us for this Freshwater Stewardship Community webinar. We're really excited to offer some specialized programming this week in celebration of Invasive Species Awareness Week. And so this is a week that is hosted by the Invasive Species Centre. And so we'll be talking about them, but looking at raising awareness about different invasive species, but also the work that is being done around them, research and on the ground action. So we'll be talking about that more today. So the two people that are going to be with you are, of course, our speaker, Michael McTavish. And if you have any questions for him that don't get answered during the chat, you can reach out to him by email. And I will also be with you. I'm Monica, and I'm the Communications and Fundraising Coordinator at Watersheds Canada. And so if you have any tech questions or specific questions about Watersheds Canada, you can private message me in the chat. You can also private message Nicole, who is our environmental technician at Watersheds Canada, and we will both be providing assistance on that side, but specific Q&A will go to Michael. So for those of you who maybe aren't familiar with our Freshwater Stewardship Community, it is an online initiative that we launched last year due to the pandemic, and it was a way for us to connect with people across the country in a way where we were used to doing it only in person. So things like AGMs and workshops, conferences, those all moved online. And so we wanted to make sure we were still connecting with people, still hearing about the problems that they were facing and the actions they were taking on the ground. And so we created this community. Since January 2021, we've had over 1,200 members join from across 7 countries. And we host programming each month. So if you go to the website, probably where you registered for this webinar, you would have seen that there is a bunch of information archived. So we have 13 webinars on there and 11 education handouts, which are all free for you to share with your network, with your lake association, your neighbors, and they're from a range of different topics and speakers. So we really encourage you after today's webinar to go and check those out. We would like to thank our different funders for the online community, specifically the Peterborough KM Hunter Charitable Foundation and the SM Blair Family Foundation. And then specifically for this week, we would like to thank the Invasive Species Centre for their funding. They're providing us with support to help with community engagement and materials to help limit barriers for people to access invasive species education resources and information from their peers. And so Invasive Species Awareness Week is February 28th to March 4th this year. And we as Watershed Canada are able to help raise awareness about this week and the action that we can all take together to stop the spread of invasive species. So we'll be talking a bit more about that at the end of today's presentation, but we would just like to encourage everyone to go either to the Freshwater Stewardship Community website, which is watersheds.ca/freshwater-stewardship, or you can go to any of our social media pages, which we'll talk about in a second, because we have some great family-oriented resources and some quizzes and things like that that will help engage you with invasive species. So if you are not familiar with our organization as a whole, we are a national nonprofit and charitable organization based in Perth, Ontario, which is about an hour away from Ottawa. We really work with community groups, youth, and individuals to help protect their lakes, rivers, and shorelines. And we do that through education and stewardship programs that are delivered on the ground. So you can see a couple examples here where we are delivering the program and working right alongside landowners and community groups to restore shoreline habitat. Like on the right, you can see we're renaturalizing a shoreline with native plants, or we may be naturalizing some fish habitat, which you can see in the bottom left. We are improving a spawning bed, or we do education and stewardship programs like Love Your Lake, which is pictured in the top left. And we're doing assessments of shoreline properties and actions that property owners can take to improve the health of their lake. As I mentioned, for this specific week, we are posting a lot of content on our social media. So in addition to the 2 webinars that are being hosted this week, today and tomorrow, we are posting different resources that you can share with your network, different fact sheets, quizzes, like I mentioned, and activities. And so you can see all of our different socials on the screen now. So now I'd like to just introduce our speaker for today. So Dr. Michael J. McTavish is a Mitacs Elevate postdoctoral research fellow working with the Smith Forest Health Lab at the University of Toronto and Ducks Unlimited Canada. His current research includes biological control of non-native invasive plants, introduced Phragmites and garlic mustard specifically, and the ecology of non-native earthworms, which we are all here to learn about today. So I will pass it over to you, Michael.
Great. Thank you, Monica, for the introduction there. I'm just going to pull up my slides here. Make sure everything's coming through all right. We're good?
Good to go.
Okay, perfect. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us here today. And I want to say again, a big thank you to Watersheds Canada for the invitation to talk about this. We are, of course, sort of adjacent to kind of water issues. So thank you for sort of giving us the wiggle room on that. Broadly, the work that I'm doing now and in the past has focused on invasive species. And the way that we think about invasion is the means in which it sort of produces novelty. So, of course, as we have an increasingly globalized world and people are moving all around the place and goods are moving around, increasingly we see species found in places where they weren't found previously. And this can produce this ecological novelty, and that can take a number of different forms. Of course, you have new species that are just a part of that ecosystem there. But species don't keep to themselves. They interact with other native species, they interact with other non-native species, and so you get these novel ecological interactions. And these can pose some major challenges to practices of conservation and restoration. A lot of my work these days, as was mentioned, the primary work is actually focused on invasive plant species, so Phragmites and garlic mustard, and specifically we're looking at how to try and manage some of these populations using the tool of biological control, so introducing natural enemies of these plants to try and keep their populations in check. Not really going to be talking about that today, but if you'd like to learn more about the Phragmites system, I would encourage you to check out Janice Gilbert's talk tomorrow, which should give you a lot of great information about that system. Today we're going to be talking about some work that dates back more to sort of some of the work that I was doing during graduate school and try and sort of keep a foot in the door with these days. And it has to do with something that doesn't always come to mind immediately when we look at the ecosystems that we're working with, the watersheds that we're managing, but that are nevertheless an incredibly important component of these habitats. And that would, of course, be earthworms. So I did a lot of my graduate research and some of this work in Waterloo, and this is, we're fortunate to have the Grand River in that area, so beautiful area to work. And so, you know, these worms aren't something that jump out to us right away, but they are there, and they are an important part of that system. Now, whether you're aware of this or not, most of the earthworms that we have in Canada are actually non-native European species. They're a part of a broader global invasion process that has seen non-native earthworms spread to every continent of the world except for Antarctica. We did have, and still do have, some native earthworms in North America as well. A lot of the ones that we lost were essentially wiped out in the last glaciation, as they're not really suitable for living under large quantities of ice. And so you essentially have an open soil niche now, which has been open to invasion by other species from different parts of the world ever since. As with so many invasions, the introduction of earthworms has very much been a human-assisted process. So earthworms, juveniles, adults, and their cocoons, which are very small and look an awful lot like soil and are easy to miss, have been introduced historically and in the present day through a variety of different vectors. So when you unload ship ballast on a foreign shore, that can be a source of introduction. In really remote areas, a lot of worms are introduced originally as bait that are then dumped into the woods. Anytime you have road work or movement of bulk soils, material can be moved that way. Even sort of smaller, surprising things like cocoons getting trapped in the treads of vehicle tires or people's shoes. And one of the really important things to drive home with the earthworm story right from the top here is the fact that realistically, we don't currently have any practical large-scale options to control non-native earthworms. So generally, once they get somewhere, they're there and they're a part of that habitat. And this has some really interesting implications down the road. We're interested in talking about earthworms because they are so influential. They are what we call ecosystem engineers. So they have this disproportionate physical impact on the habitats that they live in. So an earthworm invaded soil is fundamentally different from the soil that existed prior to their arrival. And so a lot of this has to do with this physical restructuring of what the soil looks like and therefore how it functions. Now, the soil is fundamental to essentially everything else in that ecosystem, so you have these cascading effects on the organisms that live in the soil, on vegetation, both understory plants and overstory trees, how this all functions, and so on. So I want to pull out a few examples of some of these impacts, including some of the research work that we've done over the years, just as some examples. And really, a lot of this starts with the soil surface. So earthworms are detritivores and they're decomposers. They help break down organic matter that accumulates normally on the surface of the soil. Most of our species of earthworms will bury or otherwise help break down that leaf litter. This can physically expose the surface soil and any seedlings that are trying to germinate underneath it. So this can leave plants and seeds vulnerable to drying out, or it can leave them vulnerable to herbivory by things like deer and so on. So on the left there, we've got a photo of, in a pre-earthworm invaded forest, you would normally have an accumulation of this sort of thick leaf litter layer that is then absent once they arrive. Amongst other things, they'll also accelerate the cycling of nutrients. So by breaking down that organic matter, mixing into that soil, that releases nutrients. And this sounds initially like a good thing, and it is, depending on where you are. So this is part of why we like worms in our gardens, or we like worms in an agricultural field. Those are very productive systems that can make use of those nutrients that are liberated very quickly. In contrast, a lot of our native species are not really set up to take in that huge pulse of nutrients. And so other invasive plants, for example, are able to make use of them, or those nutrients are otherwise lost from the system. So it's just sort of cycling at a different pace that our vegetation is not really able to take advantage of. Now, we talk about this leaf litter burial and collection, but we so rarely get to see it. Earthworms are primarily nocturnal in their activities. They're below ground, so we don't really get to see what they're doing. So it's kind of hard to picture the effect that this can actually have. So to change that, I want to share, these are some slides taken from a very old, actually undergraduate project I did many years ago, looking at earthworm litter foraging behavior. So this is infrared video stills. I'll direct your attention to the top left box. And what you can see, there's a little pile of dried out maple leaf litter, which is sort of a preferred food resource of theirs, and an earthworm burrow, so that dark spot there. So if you watch that burrow over the course of these slides, you'll see an earthworm. This is a dew worm or night crawler. Stick its head out, keeping its tail anchored in its burrow, make its way over to that pile of leaf litter, grab a piece of litter in its little earthworm mouth, and actually drag that back over the soil surface and then down partially into its burrow. And then over time, that leaf litter will decompose, it'll soften up, and then they're able to consume that as food. So if you think about this effect happening across an entire forest floor where you have potentially hundreds of earthworms per square meter of forest floor, you can see how large amounts of litter could be removed and break down very, very quickly. So this is a really dramatic alteration that can be introduced. In addition to burying the material and sort of removing it from the surface, you can also have other impacts as well. So this is some work from a study that was done. This is a restoration site being run by Conservation Halton near Glenorchy. This was an old agricultural field that had been growing corn and was being restored towards a tallgrass prairie system. And we were doing some work here, and what you would see is if you walked around and you looked down, you would see bits of old corn husk, sort of organic debris that is just lying on the surface from one of the last harvests. But what you notice is that it's not randomly distributed across the soil. It is instead gathered into these kind of little piles. And this is actually being done by earthworms. These are structures that we call middens. They're essentially a little larder of food that they will create by gathering organic material and pulling it towards their burrow, like we saw in that last set of slides. And so you get these little piles. And so if you're ever walking around an earthworm invaded area or even around your garden or a forest, if you look down, I guarantee that you're going to start to see some of these little piles of leaves and sticks, even rocks. They'll move around, things like that. So this is being created by earthworms. So this system, because it was a largely bare field, was a really good opportunity to go in and survey how they were moving these organic materials around on the soil surface. So we went in with this very scientific hula hoop and went around and laid out these plots and started mapping out where this organic matter was going. So you can see on the left there, those circles would be the hula hoops, and then in black are those splotches are the middens. So they covered about 17% of the soil surface area, but they contained a disproportionate 40% of the mulch. So essentially what they're doing is they're aggregating that material into these little piles. So you have these areas of soil that have a lot of material there and then a lot of bare soil. So this will spill over into effects on the water holding capacity of the soil, how many nutrients are there, temperature, all sorts of different things. And this can affect how microbes will grow, how plants will grow, and so on. So essentially, you're creating variation spatially across this soil surface. So it's not just removal, it's reorganization as well. Another area where we've done a lot of work is to look at seed interaction. So we've talked about earthworms going after leaf litter and decaying organic matter, but another food source that increasingly we know they make use of is actually seeds. So earthworms are granivores. They will eat seeds, and they'll also disperse seeds. So when an earthworm interacts with a seed, a number of different things can happen. They can ingest the seed, break it down in their gut, and the seed is destroyed. So the earthworm gets a meal, and the seed is destroyed. Sometimes the seed will be too large for them to swallow, so they'll instead pick it up and cache it below ground. So much like the leaf litter, with the idea that it will later break down and be easier to consume. Some worms will also consume seeds, but the seed won't actually be destroyed in the gut. So it goes all the way through the worm, back out the other end, largely intact into the soil, potentially at a different depth from where it started. Those seeds that make that gut passage intact, so they go right through the worm, depending on the seed species and depending on the worm species, some of those seeds will experience increased germination and some will experience decreased germination. So it's really a bit of a mixed bag. Some plants seem to benefit from these earthworm interactions and some seem to be harmed by them. To sort of look more at these earthworm seed interactions, a little study that I was doing with an honors thesis student here, Alexandra Rossi. This was work done in a temperate forest near Newmarket, Ontario. It's sort of a proof of concept of this method. Essentially, we went out in the fall to the site, sampled some earthworms, and we were trying to get an instantaneous sort of snapshot of how many seeds were actively moving through earthworms at any given time as you're walking through the woods. And what we found by collecting the seeds that worms would poop out once we collected them was that each worm had between 0 and 5 of these egestible seeds that they were going to poop back out into the soil in their guts, just at any given time as you're walking through the forest. And when we take a total accounting of all the seeds that are just in the soil in the top 10 centimeters, we find that earthworms contain 2.4% of the seeds. So it's a small fraction, but a non-zero and important fraction at the same time. So we thought this was just a really kind of fascinating way to conceptualize this, is that as you're walking through the woods below your feet with densities of potentially, say, 100 earthworms per square meter of soil, each of those worms could have between 0 and 5 seeds just actively passing through them as you're walking over. So we thought this was just an interesting way to capture how important these interactions are. We also did some work looking at how earthworms can affect the growth from seed. So we were looking at this largely from a restoration context. If you're adding seed to try and produce growth, how do earthworms affect that? We created an experiment with grass seed that we were putting down, and we were able to control the access of worms and other granivores like birds and rodents to get at them. And essentially what we found was, as you'd expect, you get the highest grass growth when nothing is there, but you get large amounts of seed removal when birds and granivores can get at them. We did find that the effect of earthworms was reduced compared to birds and rodents. They sort of weren't the primary seed predators, but they still have an effect. So in situations where earthworms are very dominant, they can reduce the amount of just plant growth that you'll get from seed because of this seed consumption and seed burial. Much like the mulch that we talked about earlier, there can be effects that are important beyond just destroying or sort of removing seeds or mulch from the area. There's also a really important spatial component that can be at play here. So we did another experiment in these sort of vertical plastic cylinders with a Lumbricus terrestris, which is a large-bodied, deep-burrowing earthworm. We were using grass seed, and we created a method in which we were able to track where earthworms were moving seeds from the surface to different positions in the soil. So we were able to create these maps. So those are the cylinders there, and each of the blue dots is a seed that we were able to track below ground. So this is sort of where earthworms had ended up putting them in the soil. And what you can sort of see if you kind of imagine kind of a diagonal line running through a lot of these cylinders, that's essentially the earthworm burrow, sort of where they're moving in that cylinder. So these seeds are being pooped out or intentionally cached in the side of their burrows. So if we think about the soil vertically, with seeds starting from plants, entering the system at the surface of the soil, earthworms can move seeds downwards. And this can have a number of different impacts on the plant. Being below ground can protect seeds from predation from things like birds and rodents, so that can be good. But if they get buried too deep, it can be difficult for those species, depending on what species it is, to germinate. So you can have a trade-off of these beneficial and detrimental impacts for different plants. If we take those same cylinders and we look from the top looking down, each of these dots is again a seed, with the darker dots being closer to the soil surface. We can see that these seeds that are left, once earthworms have gone through them, eaten a bunch, moved some around, they're not evenly distributed like they were at the beginning. They are now sort of clustered, much like the mulch was in that tall grass prairie field. And so if you get growth from these plants, those plants are now themselves clustered. So again, even if they're not destroying seeds, they can produce this spatial effect and structure the way that that vegetation is growing. So a lot of this is work that we've done in the past looking at European earthworms. But there is what we're calling now this second wave of earthworm invasion. And this is something that's quite new that I'd like to talk about today as well. Most of the time, what we've been talking about is this first wave of invasion of earthworms. These are largely European species, and they've been coming over from Europe to, amongst other places, North America, probably since the early days of European settlers making that same trip. So from the 1500s to the 1600s and onwards. And this has been an ongoing invasion. So as long as you have movement of people and goods, there's potential for further introductions. But increasingly, what we're also seeing is this so-called second wave of invasion as well. So this involves the movement of species from Asia. This is more recent, and it is sort of dating back to probably the mid-20th century, are our best estimates right now. And we're starting to see more and more of this. What we're talking about here are 16 species of ferritomoid earthworms. They come from 12 genera, and they are native to East and Southeast Asia. And what you'll find when you look online is that they go by many different common names. We refer to them typically as jumping worms, again, keeping in mind that this is a bunch of different species that are somewhat similar. But you'll also hear them referred to as snake worms or crazy worms or a number of different names as well. But they are all sort of the same group. Jumping worms differ from European earthworms in a number of really important ways. Most of the species that we see are shallow burrowing, so they're very close to the surface of the soil, so they're not doing these large vertical redistributions in the same way that we saw from some of those other species. They tend to be predominantly parthenogenetic, which means that they can reproduce on their own. Which makes them very good at forming populations from a very small number of initial individuals, which is a challenge. Most of the earthworms that we have, these European species, they tend to live for several years. Jumping worms, in contrast, have an annual life cycle. So they will hatch from cocoons in the spring, they grow very rapidly, they will try and reproduce, and then they will die off before winter and overwinter as cocoons in the soil. So overall, these traits and others make them very rapid growing invaders. They have this very fast life cycle. They have very dramatic impacts on the soil structure and soil function, even in comparison to European earthworms that were, quite frankly, already a problem. One of the other interesting differences that I like to point out is that when we think about these really large European earthworms, so if you think about these sort of chunky dew worms that are often used for fishing bait, these are typically found at very low density in the soil. They're big, but there aren't many of them. And when we have very numerous, abundant earthworms that are, again, in this sort of hundreds of individuals in a square meter of soil, they tend to be very small. Jumping worms, for some reason, seem to break that pattern. So they can be both fairly large-bodied and occur at high density. And this can translate into really significant ecological impacts because of that combination of mass and numbers. Again, as with so many invasions, this is very closely tied to human activity, specifically the horticultural trade. So jumping worms and their cocoons are largely moved around in mulch, soil, and potted plants. This would be probably how they came over to North America in the first place, and then also how they move around within North America. This happened first in the United States. At best estimate, they're now found in 38 US states. And this was largely an American problem for a very long time. So there had been a couple of isolated Canadian collections near Windsor, very close to the Detroit border. These were back in 2014, and they were made by noted earthworm taxonomist John Reynolds. But that had really been it. But we did know that they were probably coming at some point. And so that brings us to this past summer. So it was August 2021. We were doing some of our Phragmites, garlic mustard biocontrol work, and we started getting these reports from people of these kind of unusual earthworms that people were finding mostly in their home gardens. And I should say a lot of these reports came to us through the Master Gardeners of Ontario. So these are folks who really know their soils and their gardens and are very attuned to what's going on and very observant. And so they really brought this forward. And without that, we wouldn't have known about it in the first place. So we're very appreciative for that. So I was able to go out to some of these sites, take a look around, take some notes, take some samples. And sure enough, this was the first time that I had seen a jumping worm at all, but certainly in Canada. So we did some identifications, did a few collections, wrote this up in a paper with John Reynolds that basically said they're here now. We've found more of them. This is an excerpt from that paper, this map. From the samples that we'd collected, we had 4 different jumping worm species. These were overall fairly common species based on the US, so no major surprises there. But we found them concentrated around a few areas here around Windsor, Toronto, and Hamilton. So we were in a bit of a bind here. We had this unfortunate discovery that we had jumping worms in Ontario in larger numbers than previously, and we had to decide what to do next. This wasn't one of our main projects, but at the same time, it was the early days of a very important invasion, and not many people tend to look at earthworms in Canada. So we wanted to make sure that we could collect some data on this and start looking into it. So we were fortunate to be able to get Esther Tang, who's an undergraduate research student at the University of Toronto, to do some thesis work on this, working with myself. So a lot of the work that we're going to be talking about afterwards, good chunks of that have actually been done by Esther, which we've been very thankful for. The primary research question that we sort of cobbled together here was essentially to figure out the current distribution of jumping worms in southern Ontario. And we addressed this with 2 main project components. The first was to continue collecting more of these community science observation. So trying to reach out to people and see if they had seen anything similar in their area. And we paired this with a more systematic survey of Toronto's Ravine system as well. So I want to start by looking at the community science observations, and this has been a really important part of the story. It's often an important part of invasion science in general, just because of the extent to which it can extend the reach of what is possible and the geographic area with which you can operate. So once we knew that we had jumping worms here, we put together a little info sheet here with some diagnostic characters We distributed it within a fairly limited network, largely within the master gardeners initially, and we asked people to provide photos or videos so that we could tentatively ID what they were seeing. And we also collected descriptions of the habitat and any information people might have about where they think they might have come from and when they first saw them. These numbers are a little bit old now, but we have a few more observations since, but just over 20 observations so far. Fortunately, we've been able to have some form of confirmation on most of these, which has been great. So we know we are looking at jumping worms. As has been the case from the beginning, mostly what we're seeing are observations in people's gardens, though some people have also found them in public parks, and some people even found them in their houseplants indoors, which my impression was that that had been fairly upsetting, understandably. Some of the good news here was that most of the observations seem to be relatively recent. So most people we were talking to felt that this year was the first time that they had seen this. Now, that's of course a difficult thing to measure, but it is encouraging to suggest that this is fairly recent. If we look at these observations on a map here, in black we have these were observations we were able to collect specimens for. Blue are photo or video confirmed, and then the yellow-green are unconfirmed. We can see, as with before, these observations are very much concentrated around Toronto and Hamilton, though we do have some outlying observations as well, including collections from near that original Windsor site where they were first seen in 2014. We also have some really big gaps, even just in southern Ontario here, and this importantly doesn't mean that they're absent from these areas. It just means we don't know. We don't have data about it, and so filling in some of these gaps is something we really want to focus on in the years to come. So when I was out visiting some of these properties, a lot of our Toronto properties were sort of nice older houses up on the edge of these ravines in the city. And so on a whim, after visiting one of these sites, finding jumping worms in the garden, I decided to go for a little walk in the ravine that sort of downslope from the back of the property. And looking down, sure enough, there were jumping worms there. So it's not great to have these species in people's gardens, but it's also quite a bit worse to have them in more natural areas as well. So this was a bit discouraging to see. So we wanted to expand our scope to see whether this was a one-off observation or whether they were commonly found in these sort of more natural ravines in the city. So we wanted to look at what this local distribution was. For those not familiar with Toronto, there's a fairly extensive ravine network that runs throughout the city, and it's really useful for this kind of monitoring of different areas in the city. So there were again two project components here. The first was a simple geographic survey going into a collection of 11 ravines to just basically check whether jumping worms were there. This was some of Esther's work. She did a basic visual survey, so walking the main path through the whole ravine, looking for visual signs of invasion, and then also dropped some random quadrats at random intervals, excuse me, to collect some more in-depth details as well. She also conducted a seasonal survey. So I mentioned jumping worms have this annual life cycle. So they die off before winter. So we wanted to know, when does that die off tend to happen here? So this involves sampling the same ravine on a recurring weekly basis, going in, sampling the same point again, looking at how many earthworms were there, and accompanying variables such as the temperature of the soil and how moist it was. So I'll emphasize, I've got some results to share here. These are preliminary, so we're still working on it, and there's more to come on this. But we've got some of the broad findings here, and the first is from that geographic survey. So sort of a good news, bad news kind of situation. Of those 11 ravines, we found jumping worms in 4 of them, so just over a third pretty much. So this read to us as the one ravine that we saw, it wasn't the only one, but they're also not everywhere yet. Within those sites, there's quite a bit of variability in terms of how common they were. So these dots show those sampling points along that main trail. If it's filled in black, there was no sign of jumping worms. In yellow-green, jumping worms were present. So at individual sites that had jumping worms, jumping worm occurrence across these observations varied from as little as 5% of the points to as many as 94%. So if you see in the bottom, that was actually the very first ravine that I went into and took a look at. And this one was just completely filled with jumping worms. So if we look at that seasonal sampling, we can look at some of the preliminary results from that as well. In the green bars, we're going to have jumping worm density plotted on the left vertical axis there. In the dotted blue line, we're going to have soil temperature. And so going back week after week, what we found was essentially, as predicted, that those numbers start to drop off at the same time as the soil temperature gets cooler. And we sort of know that 5 to 10 degrees tends to be a bit of a cutoff for jumping worm activity. So once it gets around and below that temperature, their numbers start to drop off. And this is what we saw as well. So from November 9th onwards, we weren't finding any juvenile or adult worms. So that's an important part of this story, is that if you were to go out and take a look in the woods now or right when soils started to thaw out, you wouldn't necessarily expect to find any jumping worm activity because of this annual life cycle. So there's a lot more that we're analyzing still. We're looking at cocoon density, earthworm biomass, doing proper identifications of the species, and so on. So there'll be more to come in time as well. But what do we know from this sort of initial scramble of work responding to these initial observations? The big thing, of course, is that we now know jumping worms are present at multiple locations in Ontario. We know that we're looking at least 4 species, probably more. All evidence seems to suggest that this is a relatively recent invasion, but also not brand new. Judging from some of these sites like that ravine there with the 94% occupancy, they didn't just get there. They've been there for at least a couple of years, probably. And so this is a really good example and a lesson in invasive species work, where you don't really find these things until you go looking for them or until someone brings them forward. So we weren't checking for this on any sort of regular basis. And if people hadn't brought it forward, we would have never known for further years. We're finding them mostly in gardens, which is a big part of how they spread around, but they are able to and starting to spread to more of these natural areas as well, which is a big concern. Taken all together, we're seeing that when we look at various scales, we're finding this general story that they are not yet ubiquitous, but they're also not completely rare. Again, as a reminder, we saw them in just about a third of those ravines here. There's a lot that we still need to find out. Of course, this is still early days of this. As with any early invasion, figuring out who's here and where they are is important, so figuring out distribution. We know a fair bit about earthworm and jumping worm impact in the US, but we also need a more sort of context-specific look at what they're doing here to soils, to biodiversity. Erosion is a big concern in these ravines as well because of the physical alteration that they make to this topsoil. Another important impact that seems to be occurring, and I'll say this is just anecdotal at this point, but typically when we're finding jumping worms, we're not finding European earthworms. So they seem to actually displace them. So what are the consequences of that? And also looking at pathways of spread. How are they moving around? How quickly? How can we limit that? And so on. So what do we collectively do now with this information? For this, I would say it depends very much who we're talking about in terms of European earthworms or jumping worms. These are different situations, and I think the recommended actions are quite a bit different as well. When we think about European earthworms, we want to remember this is an invasion that has been going on and is still going on since the 1500s. They are now abundant, they are widespread, and we don't really have any way to control them. European earthworms, I think, in some places are a really interesting case to start thinking about. At what point do we start considering a species or group of species naturalized to an area, given that everything sort of comes from somewhere else at some point in time? In contrast with jumping worms, this is a very recent invasion. They're not yet widespread. They're still actively moving around, which is also true of European earthworms, to be fair. We also don't have any way to control them. They're basically the same in that regard, but we do have some options to still slow the rate at which they spread around. So what do we do with that information? Starting with European earthworms, I think this gets into some really interesting questions about how we approach restoration and how we approach conservation broadly. I think they're a good argument for making the case that the impacts of invasive species and how we manage them are really contextual. It matters what the species are changing in the ecosystem and what your restoration goals actually are. And depending on how those things kind of line up, they will have contextual impacts that range from detrimental, things that you don't like, that are working against what you're trying to do. They may be neutral and not do anything at all, or they may even be beneficial. And so where they fall on this kind of spectrum can dictate the preferred management response. If they're doing something you don't like, maybe you try and remove them or mitigate that impact. If they're not doing anything, maybe you just sort of tolerate it. If they're doing something helpful, maybe you try and use that to your advantage or even enhance what they're doing. Working in restoration, which is when I did a lot of this doctoral work, we were looking at how often you're trying to take some sort of degraded ecosystem and move it towards some sort of traditional historical target, or which is often a moving target in and of itself. But once you get something major like earthworms come in, that historical target or historical trajectory is really no longer a valid target. You have this novelty that is going to push you towards something a little bit different, sort of this novel restoration target. And so the role of research then becomes trying to understand the role of this new species in the degraded ecosystem and in whatever you're trying to restore to. So that ecological novelty is just now a part of that system. And I think that's what we're looking at with European earthworms in particular. The trick is then to take your understanding of those novel interactions and try and, as suggested on that sort of spectrum, mitigate the undesirable impacts and use the complementary effects. So in the case of earthworms, for example, we saw how digestion of seeds could be detrimental to restoration efforts, or aggregation of mulch that you're trying to use to restore a soil is not helping because they're sort of bunching it up into all these piles. We also saw how earthworm seed caching can help protect seeds from predators and help form a seed bank. We also saw how earthworms could affect different soil amendments like wood ash and help mix them into a soil where it was otherwise difficult to do so. These were actually helpful effects of non-native earthworms. And so if we take the good and the bad and try and customize what we're doing, you might, for example, take what we know about earthworm seed interactions and try and make a custom seed mix that does well when you have lots of earthworms there. Or you try and use soil amendments that are going to interact well with how earthworms move them around. If they're aggregating all your mulch, one of the best ways to offset that impact is to just add more mulch, but you need to know to do that in the first place. The jumping worm story, I think, is a little bit more, is different at any rate. The most important thing to do right now is know that they are here. In our context, we're talking about Southern Ontario because that's where we've been looking so far. But here could also be, for example, Atlantic Canada. We have colleagues that are working out there that are starting to follow up on initial reports of jumping worms out east. And realistically, once you start looking in all these different places, there's a good chance now or in the near future you might start to find them there as well. To do this, of course, you have to know what you're looking for. Fortunately, jumping worms are behaviorally and morphologically fairly distinct from European earthworms. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail right here, but overall, they basically look different. If we look at their overall sort of body, they tend to have this smooth, shiny characteristic to them. The clitellum, which is this ring-like band that you can see close to their head, it tends to be this sort of distinctive milky coloration on the jumping worms. It also runs all the way around the body, whereas on a European earthworm, it sort of sits more on top, much like a saddle. Behaviorally, they're very different. When you disturb them, they'll sort of thrash and jump around, which is where they get their jumping worm name from. Some species will also drop the sort of latter part of their tail, basically self-amputate that in an attempt to try and get away. Even if the worms themselves aren't present, or if you're in an off season where you expect them to be not alive at that time, you can also look indirectly for evidence of their casts. So this is the waste material that they poop out onto the soil surface. Jumping worm casts have this really distinctive kind of loose, crumbly texture. On the left, it looks a lot like dried coffee grounds. Whereas European earthworm casts are this kind of smooth, kind of clumped up structure. As we said right from the get-go, large-scale control of earthworms is, in my opinion and many other people's opinion, impossible. But at the same time, we don't want to try and spread it around. We want to slow things down and not help it out as much as possible because the rate of change is very important. We want to give these systems as much time to adapt as possible. So if you're in an area where you think you have jumping worm activity now, the general recommendation would be to refrain from moving mulch, soil, or other infested plants or materials from invaded areas to other areas. If you're looking at something very small scale, like a garden bed or a single potted plant, material can be safely disposed of by bagging it up very thoroughly or solarizing it. So we know high temperature will kill earthworms and it will kill cocoons. But if you're looking at anything larger, this just isn't really feasible. If you're looking for more information about jumping worms, I would direct you to the Invasive Species Centre website. They have a new profile on these species that we helped build. You can check that out at the link there. Information about where they are is really important at this stage, and the best place to do that is to report sightings to EDMAPS, and there's a link for that here, so you can just log in and note where you made this observation, ideally providing a photo to back up that observation. And we are going to continue working on this as well. So if you think you have jumping worms, or if you have questions, or if you're in some sort of stewardship capacity and are interested in incorporating jumping worm assessment into your monitoring, please feel free to get in touch. And my contact info will be there later as well. As with any invasion, this early detection rapid response is really essential. So we're looking at a critical window of time right now. With jumping worms, we have this really stark, dramatic ecological impact, which is quite scary, but we also know that they're here pretty early. And they're fairly easy to monitor. So I think that gives us a bit of hope as well. So do stay tuned on this story, because I think we're going to be hearing more about it in the years to come. So overall, just kind of to wrap up here, I've always thought earthworms are a really interesting group to work with. They are so easily missed. They're nocturnal, they're below ground, they're kind of icky to a lot of people, but they are so influential ecologically. This fact was not lost on one Charles Darwin, who is said to have noted that worms have played a more important part in the history of the world than humans would at first suppose. It wasn't his best known book, but Darwin's last book in his life was actually on earthworms. So we're keeping very good company in recognizing how important they are. The fact that we have this really global invasion of species slowly moving around the world and being redistributed in part by human actions, in large part by human actions, that they're filling niches that were once occupied by very similar but native species, that we can't really get rid of them, I think raises some really challenging questions about comparisons between native and non-native species. At what point do we start to think about species as naturalized, and the goals of conservation itself in the first place? So regardless of whether we think they belong here or not, and whatever that means, non-native earthworms are very much here to stay. They are a part of our watersheds, and it's important for us to learn more about the profound ecological impacts they have and how to manage them. So thank you very much. We've had many supporters for this work over the years, and we greatly appreciate that support. I've got some contact info here if you want to reach out, and I'd be happy to take some questions now. Oh, I think you're muted there, Monica. Sorry.
That kind of day. I was just
Yep.
saying thank you for all of that amazing information, and that if you didn't catch everything that Michael was linking out to throughout that presentation, we have created a handout with some of those community science initiatives, especially some of the research papers that Michael was referencing. We have that all in one document, and we will be emailing that out to everyone along with the recording from today. So if you have other people you think might be interested or might be able to organize some sort of community effort, that handout will be a really handy resource for you. I've also dropped Michael and my email in the chat. If people have any questions that they think of afterwards, please feel free to reach out either of us. And I'm also going to drop in the link for the survey for today. So it is an anonymous survey. It should take you less than 5 minutes, I guess, unless you have really wonderful things to say about Michael, just so we can know how today went. And if you have any ideas of presenters or future topics you would like to be featured in the freshwater stewardship community, that would be the place to tell us. So we will now go through some of the different questions that were submitted. We have some that were submitted ahead of time when people registered, and I think they have been echoed a bit by some of the ones in the chat too. So the first one would be, can you comment on vermicomposting?
Sure. Yeah, so vermicomposting, for those not familiar with it, is essentially using earthworms and taking advantage of the role that they play as decomposers to break down organic material as a form of composting. I would say I lived in an apartment for many years that didn't have any composting, so we actually ran one in our kitchen as well. I'll say it's a little fiddly, but it can be a really great tool, especially if you don't have an alternative waste stream for dealing with organics. In terms of sort of concerns, ecologically speaking, vermicomposting typically uses a specific species, Icenia fetida, or red worms, or red wigglers would be sort of a common name for them. These are a sort of fairly small, kind of red tinted, they are non-native worms, but we almost never see these escape out of sort of indoor environments. They don't have the cold tolerance to deal with, especially in sort of North America winters. So if any do get out, they don't really survive outside of a compost pile. So these are broadly, I would say, a really good tool for dealing with organics, and not a major concern sort of ecologically at present anyway, so long as you're using the right species.
Perfect. And a couple questions in the chat are also talking about the pathways of spread. So I know, especially when you go camping, it's all about bringing your own firewood. And so people are asking about transporting garden soil. So especially people who have maybe a cottage that they buy the soil and everything ahead of time and then bring it to the cottage. Is that something that they should be worried about? Is there a way for them to check their soil?
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, anytime you're moving around plants, soil, there's always the potential to move worms, European or jumping worms, and their cocoons. With European worms, I would sort of say at this point, the cat's kind of out of the bag. You don't worry about it too much. Don't try and intentionally move things around, but beyond that, don't worry about it. For jumping worms, as I said, the signs that they are there are fairly obvious once you know what to look for. So long as you're looking at the right season, sort of in spring, summer, fall, you can see their activity, their casting, the adults, they're pretty sort of striking when you see them. So if they are there, that can be something that you can engage with in terms of trying to find an alternate source, being conscientious about not sort of redistributing that. Something I really try and focus on with this, though, is that I'll often hear from people who will feel quite bad, like that they've failed at something in some way, that they have jumping worms on their property, and really this isn't people's fault. This is something that ideally would be addressed at a higher regulatory level, and sort of for bigger reasons than sort of I'd like to get into right here today. This isn't really regulated, not directly at this point. So there's only sort of so much you can do at kind of a consumer level. Basically being aware where you can. If you think you have them, try not to sort of actively move that material around any faster, than it would move on its own. And then beyond that, I would sort of say try not to lose any sleep over it.
Okay, there was a question in the chat about the distribution of the European and the jumping worm, but I think you already answered that at the end, that there are some other populations and there are probably other places too, but that's where the community science really comes into it.
Yeah. Oh, actually, sorry, Monica, I just realized on that sort of spread and thinking about camping as well, another aspect to that is I had mentioned as well, sort of the footwear. I mean, this is a general good invasive species sort of takeaway is if we're like if you're moving your boat or something like that, making sure you're cleaning off equipment, vehicles, footwear. If you're just doing a hike, being conscientious about sort of knocking off your shoes so that you're not spreading anything, any unwanted hitchhikers. The worms themselves don't really sort of get stuck to your shoe, but again, their cocoons, which can be just a couple of millimeters or less than a millimeter large, can very easily sort of get trapped in there. So sort of being careful to move that. And wood, we're learning that earthworms can actually live in down woody debris as well, so not moving around woody material either. So essentially sort of keep as much in its place as much as possible.
And that kind of leads into our next question, which is about people who are fishing. So, where's the level of education with what people should do with leftover worms? Because I think at this point, that was seen as maybe the safe thing to dispose of. So where would the education come in for that
Right.
audience?
Yeah, so right now the burden on that is primarily on if it's a park or a private park or public park or provincial park, they will put up some signage about that. And I would say I've seen much more of that sort of over the years as well. So if it is a fishing area, they'll sort of post a notice about that, just to not be dumping material out into the woods in particular. We've seen that seems to be one of the major ways, especially in sort of more northern Ontario, that you'll get new populations as well. Worms on their own move very, very slowly, sort of a few meters or less per year, depending on the species. So in order to get the level of spread that we have, a lot of that comes from people kind of hopping in their car, going hundreds of kilometers, and then dumping a bunch of worms in the woods to make a new population. So limiting that as much as possible would really help restrict that dispersal.
Some people are asking about why, I mean, you mentioned at the beginning with the Phragmites and the garlic mustard, you're trying out different biological controls. Why is that not something that either works with worms or hasn't been tried?
Right. So I would say hasn't been tried is primarily an economic sort of matter. Typically, biocontrol takes generally many decades of work to ensure that it's done accurately, especially in terms of host specificity. So making sure that your biocontrol agents are going to go after only the target species that you want and sort of nothing else. So a lot of work has to go into that, which means there has to be a good economic argument for it in the first place to fund it. I would strongly argue earthworms do have many economic impacts on sort of overall biodiversity, forest productivity, if you're looking at sort of timber sector and so on. But we don't have a lot of good data that links those sort of directly one-to-one. And these tend to be larger scale impacts that take a number of years to take hold. So I think there isn't a strong enough direct economic link to facilitate that. There has been some look at predatory flatworms, for example, some bacteria and other potential biological control agents to deal with earthworms. But of course, we're dealing with many different species. In Canada, we have, I believe, 35 species is our new count for Canada. So you have to really take a close look at what's being targeted by a potential biocontrol agent. So it's not just one plant that we're going after, it's multiple earthworms, including native earthworms that we're sort of trying to protect as well. So there's potential for that tool down the road, but it's still very much in development.
Okay, I think for the remaining questions, what I'll do is I'll follow up with you directly, Michael, and we can put together a little document with the answers, just so we are respectful of people's time. And
Sounds
that
good.
will come out in an email to everyone, like I said, with the recording in the handout. So I'm just going to quickly share what that looks like. So you're going to be getting this handout. It's going to be sent as a PDF. So the links will be like, you can just click through, hyperlinked, and it's a summary of today's presentation and also a really great way for people to share the information that was presented today. So if you have, again, like a lake association, a gardening group, a nature group that you want to share this with, you can use this tool. You can also, of course, send the full recording. And the link that I just dropped in the chat is for tomorrow's presentation. So we will be talking about another invasive species, one that probably we are all unfortunately very familiar with, which is Phragmites. And Janice will be talking about ways to control it on both a local and more broader scale. So if you are interested in that, or even if you can't attend live, but you would like to get the recording, please register again at watersheds.ca/freshwater-stewardship, and you will get all of the wonderful resources that are shared tomorrow. So with that, I think we are right at 3. Michael, thank you very much for the presentation, for spending the hour with us and talking about all the different ways that we can work together and combat some of these invasive species, and just especially the community science, I think, is really important for invasive species. So just really thankful for you taking the time today.
Absolutely. Thanks very much again.